president passes the word, yes to new taxes. On Capitol Hill, it comes as a thunderbolt. And new environmental decisions on offshore drilling and endangered owls. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. President Bush reversed course today. He came out for higher taxes. This ends his read my lips, no new taxes campaign promise. It follows weeks of election year maneuvering with Congress about the huge and growing national debt. Besides tax increases, Mr. Bush called again for spending cuts today. These could include Social Security and Medicaid, among other programs designed to help the poor and the old. Our chief White House correspondent, Leslie Stahl, begins our coverage. Leslie?
Dan, the president's turnaround is a stunning one. Not only is he abandoning his own most politically potent campaign pledge, he's reversing 10 years of Republican catechism on taxes. But instead of announcing it on camera, Mr. Bush issued a piece of paper. The statement by the president says that because of the growing deficit, a budget package requires tax revenue increases. In person, Mr. Bush refused to be any more specific.
I want jobs. I want to see the deficit down. And this bipartisan statement speaks for itself.
The statement also said a package would require entitlement and mandatory program reform as well as spending cuts. But the stunner was taxes.
Aren't some voters going to feel you broke your promise, sir?
At breakfast, the Democratic leaders told the president if he didn't take the first step on taxes, the budget summit would come apart. When he did, they promised not to pound away at the flip-flop.
I would hope that this would not be the subject of anybody's effort to create political advantage.
And yet, Chief of Staff John Sununu raced to Capitol Hill to calm down riled-up Republicans, telling them there's nothing new in the president's statement.
He hasn't said any more today than he said initially. No preconditions. Everything's on the table.
That's not how the Democrats see it.
The English language could not possibly be any more clear, and the efforts now to describe it otherwise are completely false and inconsistent with the statement itself.
When the budget negotiators meet tomorrow, they'll begin discussing what this means for the average family, whether it's higher taxes on gasoline, liquor, inheritance, or on the wealthy, and whether Social Security increases and farm subsidies are cut.
Democrats don't like cutting entitlement programs, but they're going to have to do it. Republicans don't like raising revenues. They're going to have to do it.
Congressional sources say the president sided with Budget Director Darman and Treasury Secretary Brady, who argued that the exploding S&L crisis means higher taxes are necessary. The sources say that the president's decision has left Chief of Staff Sununu, quote, unhappy. Dan?
Thank you, Leslie. Now, for the reaction in Congress tonight, including fast and furious election year reaction from many Republicans, our chief Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer has the latest from Capitol Hill. Bob?
Dan, the president's statement on taxes hit the Capitol like a thunderbolt, and Sununu's attempted damage control was not enough to reassure many of the Republicans here. There was a mini revolt among some of the party's firebrands, who immediately began gathering signatures on petitions urging the president not to raise taxes.
There is no mood on the part of his allies in the Congress to vote for any package that has tax increases in it.
The main thing is the president has to stick to his guns. No new taxes, period.
We who support the president probably 95% of the time are emphatic in saying we don't want any new taxes. Stick to your pledge, Mr. President. No new taxes.
If you tuned into the House floor, you understood quickly why Republicans facing tough races in the poll were unnerved.
George Bush has announced that he's raising taxes. The charade is finally over. But what a price the American people have paid for this masquerade.
Even Mr. Bush's old opponent chimed in from Boston.
I told the truth and I paid the price. Mr. Bush did not, and we are all now going to have to pay for that.
As Democratic strategists told it, the president had dealt a deadly blow to his own troops.
My personal political judgment is that he just took them off at their knees, took away some of their strongest political issues, and I think that's the reason it's going to be a real test of his leadership, because he's going to have a very splintered, fractious, and I think rambunctious Republican Party in the next few days.
In fact, that rebellion prompted a round of Republican strategy sessions on Capitol Hill, and by late afternoon, that argument that the president had really said nothing new.
The fact is that President Bush this morning issued a release which said essentially the same thing that we've been saying now for 2 months, which is that everything's on the table.
So the one thing that can be said for certain, I suppose, tonight is that if the president does go for new taxes, Dan, he's going to have to fight his own party to get them.
Bob Schieffer, thanks. Now, joining us now from Capitol Hill for added perspective and context on the budget talks and how they could affect you and your family, Senate Budget Committee Chairman, Senator Jim Sasser of Tennessee. Senator, thank you for being with us tonight. Now, we just heard White House Chief of Staff John Sununu, among others, say the president didn't say what you and other Democrats say that he said today. What are we to make of this?
Well, I guess we have to assume, Dan, that the president still speaks for the president rather than Governor Sununu speaking for the president. And the president very clearly said today in a statement that we need increased tax revenues to deal with this deficit problem. So I take the president at his word. He's examined this whole situation very carefully and come to the conclusion, apparently, that this nation needs new taxes to lower this deficit.
And, Senator, what is the president going to get? One, he will get the capital gains tax for the wealthiest Americans he wants. Any doubt about that?
I think there is a substantial doubt about that. Many who are engaged in these budget negotiations are going to make it part of our agenda to try to reverse this regressive tax structure that's been imposed on the American people during the decade of the 1980s. We want to try to bring some measure of tax fairness for middle-class Americans, and perhaps those who made the great gains in the 1980s should now pay some of the bills coming due in the 1990s.
Senator, I want to make sure I understand. Are you saying to me, or are you, that in the end it isn't going to be Americans in middle economic brackets who are going to pay most of the increased taxes?
I think many of us are going to fight very hard to see that there is some tax equity that comes out of these budget negotiations. That's not to say that there won't be some increased taxes for all concerned, but we want to minimize the impact on middle-class people, and if there are tax increases, we want to make sure that those who gain from the policies of the 80s pay the bills in the 90s.
We have only a few seconds left, but there are going to be Social Security cuts. There will be cuts in programs such as Medicaid. That's part of the deal, isn't it?
No, there is no deal, Dan. I think that's very clear, that the president and those who discussed the matter with him this morning came away with no final conclusion other than there will be increased tax revenues, reductions in entitlements, but all of that's going to have to be determined on down the line.
Senator Jim, sorry. Senator,
go ahead.
You say they have to be determined on down the line.
That's
Senator
correct.
Sasser of Tennessee, thank you very much for being with us this
Thank you,
live.
Dan.
We want to emphasize that President Bush's Chief of Staff, John Sununu, White House Budget Director, Richard Darman, and the Secretary of the Treasury all declined to be interviewed on this broadcast tonight about what is the President's position and what is their position. President Bush issued his decision today on a sensitive environmental and election year issue, offshore oil drilling. Deborah Potter has more on oil and water and politics.
The long-awaited decision puts a 10-year hold on new oil drilling in large areas off the West Coast, the Florida Keys, and Cape Cod.
It's a recognition that we have had some environmental concerns. There's a new wind blowing, as the president says.
The areas involved are prime fishing grounds and sensitive marine habitats. As of today, off-limits to new drilling until the turn of the century, while the environmental impact is studied. But drilling in other areas, including the Gulf of Mexico, will continue and could be expanded. Today's decision was designed as a compromise between energy production and environmental protection, and it satisfied almost no one, least of all George Bush's old colleagues in the oil industry.
Locking up these energy-rich areas at a time when our dependency on foreign energy is escalating is a serious mistake.
Supporters of a total ban on offshore drilling also were critical, saying today's announcement doesn't go far enough.
California needs permanent protection of the California coast, beginning right now. Instead, President Bush has given us a decade of delay.
This is a victory for the environmental movement, but it's only a temporary reprieve.
The decision also has political overtones, with the White House hoping to help Republican candidates running for governor this year in Florida and California, where offshore drilling is unpopular.
I don't think they're indifferent to who becomes governor of California, if that is your question. I would not be in their situation.
Drilling opponents fear that if the political wind changes, the new administration policy could simply blow away. So they plan to keep pressing in Congress for a permanent ban. Deborah Potter, CBS News, Washington.
Another environmental issue for President Bush and his administration today, after officially adding the northern spotted owl last Friday to the government's list of threatened animals, U.S. officials began hedging today on what, if anything, they propose to do about it. Correspondent Jerry Bowen reports on threatened owls, the threatened environment versus threatened jobs in the Pacific Northwest timber country.
The Bush administration's preliminary plan to save the threatened northern spotted owl stunned environmental groups today. Instead of embracing a Forest Service report that would remove 3 million acres of owl habitat from logging at a cost of 28,000 jobs over the next 10 years, the administration revealed a vague plan that would mean the loss of 21,000 jobs, and proposed further study to determine if that number can be reduced.
We'll simply look for more creative and constructive ways to preserve jobs while also preserving protections for the owl.
The administration also proposed changing the Endangered Species Act in order to allow more consideration to be given to economic impacts. Conservation groups say that's an act of sabotage.
It looks as though President Bush has declared war on the Endangered Species Act. We are very disturbed.
It looks like the administration is once again ignoring all the science they have and all the advice of their best science and trying to go with a political fix instead in favor of the timber industry.
For the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest, the administration's approach is the first good news in months.
As you all know, you can't run a sawmill on promises. Today, I think, is the first time we've seen the possibility of some light at the end of the tunnel.
But it may be a flickering light. Congress must approve the administration's plan, and it doesn't appear the self-proclaimed environmental president has all the votes he'll need. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
A report due out tomorrow from a U.S. advisory board on child abuse finds, quote, an astronomical increase in maltreatment, up from about 60,000 cases reported in 1974 to 2.4 million in 1989. Many experts think drugs, especially crack, is one of the reasons. But whatever the reasons, the advisory board created by Congress says child abuse and neglect now represent a national emergency, and existing child protection systems are inadequate and should be replaced. Still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, correspondent Bruce Morton on the debate in the Louisiana legislature to restrict abortions, and Ray Brady on Donald Trump's new allowance, $450,000 a month. In what could be the second largest cash theft in U.S. history, robbers stole more than $10 million from an armored truck near Rochester, New York today. Guards for the Armored Motor Service of America told police they had stopped at a market for coffee en route to the Federal Reserve Bank in Buffalo when they were accosted by a gunman. The guards said they were forced to drive to an isolated wooded area where they were tied up by the robbers who then fled with the money, $10.8 million in cash. The Louisiana State Senate is poised for a vote tonight on what would be the toughest abortion restrictions in the United States. Louisiana is the latest battleground in the state-by-state battle over abortion policy. Bruce Morton is there.
The abortion debate came to Louisiana today as the state Senate took up a bill which would ban almost all abortions except some to save the life of the mother. Anti-abortion forces have tried and failed in other states to pass a bill which the Supreme Court could use to overturn the Roe decision which made abortion legal. This may be their last chance this year.
This is what this bill is all about today. Whether or not these little boys and girls will have a chance to live or not.
Some of the symbols are familiar, this candlelight vigil by abortion rights supporters, but some are different.
Hail Mary, full of grace.
Louisiana has a strong anti-abortion history. The movement is an alliance between two powerful groups, Catholics and Protestant fundamentalists. Representative Lewis Jenkins led the successful fight for this bill in the House.
Let's stand up for the right to life of this little girl in Louisiana and all over America.
The debate in the Senate is over what exceptions to a ban on abortion there should be. Governor Buddy Roemer has threatened a veto.
The bill that doesn't protect the life and health of the mother, that doesn't allow for exemptions of rape and incest, is unacceptable to me as a human being.
In fact, that's where the first key vote came. The Senate strengthened the language protecting the health of the mother, then turned to an exemption for rape and incest.
Just a small percentage of rape and incest victims that get pregnant. Let's put this amendment on.
If you vote for this amendment, then you're voting for abortion on demand, you're voting to kill the bill, and you're voting to kill this child.
The amendment failed. No exemption for rape or incest.
13 yeas and 26 nays, and the amendments have failed to pass.
The debate is continuing, but the Louisiana Senate, like the House before it, seems determined to pass the very kind of tough anti-abortion bill the governor has promised to veto. Dan?
Bruce Morton, thanks in Baton Rouge. The Vatican today told Roman Catholic theologians to uphold church teachings on birth control and other moral issues or keep quiet. The Vatican reports that theologians must not, and I quote now, succumb to the temptation of dissent and should not voice their objections in the mass media. The report, approved by Pope John Paul, said the church has suffered, quote, serious harm from open criticism. It said church doctrine is not a matter of free speech. Stay with us now for more news, including Harold Dow on Nelson Mandela's historic speech to a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress. Nelson Mandela went before a joint meeting of Congress today to give his vision of the future in South Africa. Harold Dow reports.
Mr. Speaker, Nelson Mandela.
The man from Africa received a thunderous reception as he made his way down the aisle, his hand seized time after time by the legislative power brokers of America. For a man who less than 5 months ago was in a prison cell, this was a moment to be savored. For the first time on his U.S. tour, Mandela revealed his vision of a new South Africa.
This complex South African society, which has known nothing but racism for 3 centuries, should be transformed into an oasis of good race relations, where the black shall to the white be sister and brother, a fellow South African.
Mandela's answer to concerns about violence in South Africa was a warning.
Peace will not come to our country and region until the apartheid system is ended.
Mandela's image as a world hero could pose problems for the South African government at the negotiating table and for President F.W. de Klerk when he visits Washington later this year. Today, though, the two sides were in harmony.
His purpose will be essentially the same as Mr. Mandela's. That is to be able to brief American leaders and the American public firsthand on his visions for a new South Africa, which, let me assure you, will differ very, very little from Mr. Mandela's visions.
Nelson Mandela leaves Washington with the promise that sanctions will be maintained, a chance that new money will be made available to the ANC, and applause ringing in his ears. Harold Dow, CBS News, Washington.
Soviet leaders confirmed today that they are talking about possibly postponing next week's crucial for Mikhail Gorbachev Soviet Communist Party Congress, but late in the day the Soviet KGB chief said the Congress would open as scheduled on Monday. Temperatures above 100 hit the Pacific Southwest again today. 122 degrees in Phoenix, Arizona, breaking yesterday's all-time record by 2 degrees. The low for Phoenix was 91 this morning. Downtown Los Angeles reached a record 101 degrees. It was even hotter elsewhere, 109 degrees in Burbank, California. The heat's still on Donald Trump, too. Bankers today approved a short-term loan for New York real estate man and casino operator Trump, while agreeing in principle to a bigger long-term rescue effort. As with any bank transaction, there were conditions. But even with his wings clipped and the future clouded, Donald Trump will be flying high. CBS News business correspondent Ray Brady has our report.
For wheeler dealer Donald Trump, his biggest gamble may be paying off. The banks today came up with bailout money, $20 million he needed by tonight to keep from defaulting on interest payments.
The banks don't want to acknowledge the fact that they have made bad loans and therefore are prepared to throw good money after bad.
Trump seemed to know the banks were his ace in the hole.
Over the years, I've surprised a lot of people. The biggest surprise is yet to come.
For the banks, the biggest surprise may have been Donald Trump's checkbook. To get his loans, the banks say he's got to make sacrifices. He's got to cut back his personal spending to $450,000 a month. That's $450,000 a month.
Oh, please. I don't think I could spend it in a year.
I can live on $450,000 a month. Oh, boy.
$450,000. Don't you think that sounds nuts?
For Donald Trump, personal spending is only part of the game. Last month, his personal bills came to $583,000. But he had other expenses as well. The 727, another $246,000 a month. The famous yacht, $841,000. And every month, over $2 million in interest on credit charges.
Well, most of us have to be on a budget. Why not Donald Trump?
But the Donald's still a debtor. He's got to sell off a lot, like the Trump Princess. The yacht's been hawked on Tokyo TV.
It is gold. Gold.
But even the Japanese aren't buying. So Donald Trump, once the symbol of the go-go 1980s, is discovering what most Americans already know. Even when the party's over, the bills keep rolling in. Ray Brady, CBS News, New York.
And that's the news from our world tonight. Dan Rather for the CBS Evening News. Tomorrow night we'll be broadcasting from Los Angeles. See you then.